to record. Oh,
Oh,
there we go.
Awesome.
Somebody's recorded it. Is that
wonderful.
you, Pavel?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, cool.
So, Pavel, just remind I will have to finish at quarter past.
Yeah.
Um, but good to meet you all, everybody, and thank you for joining this session. I am gonna just repeat the two themes that I thought we might discuss. The first one is in terms of the relationship between science as a form of inquiry and contemplation. And the second one is whether the modern framing of science and religion poses challenges and obstacles for the project for this conference, which is the ambition to formulate what you wrote, Pavel, in a document to formulate a contemplative science or to treat contemplative philosophy as a form of scientific, rigorous endeavor. So these are the two. We'll divide it, probably have 10, 15 minutes for each. Um, I just want to say a couple of things very quickly about the first one, in case we are not all on the same page, which is that, as you probably all know, science, as a word that is primarily used to refer to a form of inquiry, is relatively recent, which means that traditionally the better way to think about this is different forms of philosophy. And up until about the 17th century, the philosophy that would be divided would be natural philosophy, moral philosophy, and so on and so forth. Um, so when we talk about science in relation to contemplation, we are primarily needing to make a distinction between the modern definition of science and pre-modern understanding of science, which is generically a form of inquiry that you might want to associate with philosophy, episteme, scientia in Latin and Greek, which is just a form of knowledge seeking. Now, in relation to the pre-modern form, however, it is important to note that the inquiry of natural philosophy before the 17th century, it has been pointed out by historians and philosophers, been primarily associated with what's called the vita contemplativa, which is the life of contemplation. Now, that term is a little bit vague unless we expound on what it means. It really traces back to Aristotle, who argues that the contemplative life is the highest and the most fulfilling telos, the fulfillment of the human life, which means that to engage in pure activity of exercising our minds in contemplation is really the highest form of human activity. And so, in that regard, to situate natural philosophy, the engagement of understanding nature um, with contemplative life, is to say that the pure activity itself of engaging in the study of nature and contemplating nature is in itself the most fulfilling goal. Now that has been developed by various schools, Neoplatonism, Christians and monastics, etc. And up until the 17th centuries, some people still think that, but historians mostly think that one of the things that's worth thinking about is whether in the 17th and 18th century and in modern science, there's a shift to conceive the nature of scientific inquiry as a shift from being associated with the vita contemplativa to the vita activa, which Aristotle would call a kind of activity that has a purpose, has a utility, um, which is involved in a practical life, in the conditions of how we live, in the making of things, and so on and so forth. So that's the first framing I wanted to mention, is that um, the shift has meant that it is difficult to really have a singular definition of what is the relationship between science and contemplation. Before the modern times, there's a fairly universal understanding of that, but now it's really, I would say, up for debate. So I now just want to open the floor for discussion on this relationship. That's all that I want to say on this. Anyone has any thoughts about the relationship between science and contemplation and how it should and shouldn't normatively function, or how is it currently functioning in scientific research?
Just one thought that comes to mind is math seems like this really interesting bridge point that's like a very contemplative practice that you can kind of do in your armchair, and you're exploring these forms that you can get deeper and deeper into, and then touching on Levin's presentation as well as Noak's presentation yesterday, there's this kind of mysterious, quite profound way in which it seems to also, so that seems like an interesting link between the vita activa and the vita contemplativa that you brought up.
Excellent point.
It's
Totally.
very interesting that you call mathematics a contemplative activity. Why do you think would we call mathematics a contemplative activity?
So why do we call it?
Yes, why would mathematics be a contemplative activity?
It Yes, it depends on your philosophical inclinations. So let's give two historical examples, okay? So the Aristotelians would say that mathematics is contemplative because, in a sense, it involves a understanding of something that it's a pure understanding. So that means there is no necessarily an important derivative function to that activity, and it engages the mind. And that distinguishes between activities that are primarily useful, right, versus activity that are not useful in that sense, that it's a pure activity that engages the mind. Or if you take the Platonic position, it would be that it involves a kind of vision, a seeing that doesn't directly have to, though it doesn't directly have to necessarily pass through materiality. It doesn't have to, it can be. A pure theoria in the Platonic tradition, which has no anything to do with materiality, would be beyond mathematics. It would be gnosis, it would be noetic activities. So mathematics is somehow kind of between pure contemplative activity. It's a contemplative activity partially, if you're a Platonist, because it is potentially it's not necessary to pass through materiality. That would be another way of thinking
The
about it.
definition here of contemplative activity has to do with sort of some kind of remove from material considerations, from empiricism also.
In the Platonist sense, yes. In the Aristotelian sense, you don't necessarily have to.
So
So
it would be amazing if you could give us a definition of contemplative activity based on Plato, Aristotle, and whatever tradition is out there. That would be very useful, actually.
perhaps I should summarize. I don't know if you heard what I said at the beginning, which is I think before the 17th century, there could be a point of defining universally what that means. After the 17th century, my understanding is that it's anything goes because there's no universal agreement about what constitute contemplation, especially because of the shift in terms of philosophical inquiries. So I would give my own definition if you want to hear, but that's not to say it's the only one available. Wolfgang, do you want to say something?
You're muted.
Yeah, I just had to unmute. Thanks. I was just trying to look up, but maybe I'll find the link. We had an interesting discussion yesterday in the breakout group with John Dunn on the question of, well, also how to define what does contemplative mean. And I mean, I cannot say it now with precision, but I can see it quite different framings. I think Xavier, you were there also yesterday. Maybe you can help, maybe bring in that perspective as well. What I do remember is that one facet of it was maybe I'm misrepresenting a little bit and put in my own thoughts of it, but that it also has the characteristic of some kind of transforming you as you engage in it, and that is somehow connected with becoming more aware of the immediacy of experience vis-a-vis. So I wonder if there's a tension or not, or compatibility or not, or to what extent between if you go purely into mind space and you could actually maybe become to a certain extent less aware of many facets of your experience, like losing touch with your embodied experience, for instance. So depending on how you define contemplative and motivated or aligned with what kinds of traditions, you could maybe argue, oh, that actually maybe removes you a little bit. Or from another perspective, you could say, well, now actually it's kind of like it gets you. So yeah, anyways,
Thanks.
interesting.
That's very helpful. That's very helpful. If I were to sum up in a way that will defines the word across the traditions, including the non-Hellenistic one, I would say that it can be something like transformative clarity of vision, or clarity of vision that that brings transparency, because I think the transformation in these traditions, though I know less about the Eastern traditions, as technically they are all supposed to come through a particular sense of transparency. And that transparency is a kind of contact, is a kind of acquaintance, is a kind of intimacy. And sometimes people would distinguish that transparency of vision from, let's say, a loving, compassionate acquaintance. I would say that, at least from the tradition I know better, the Platonic tradition, it tends to be that those two aspects of it are considered the same. So the more you grow in the transparency of your vision, let's say you are a biologist, the more and more you know inside out how your cell is going to grow. At least the tradition I'm working from within, they would say that you grow then in a deeper kind of intimacy that generates a kind of love or compassion or care, and that kind of growth is hand in hand with the clarity, the increasing clarity of vision. But what you said is extremely helpful. Thank you. So my definition would be something like transformative clarity of vision.
That's an amazing definition. It wasn't clear to me that contemplation has to do with clarity
Yes.
and transformative clarity. So I'm so super confused because where I came across the word most of the time recently is the debate in Christianity in Spain at
Yep.
the time of John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila about meditative prayer versus contemplative prayer.
Yeah.
But that means something else, right?
No, okay. So I can give a little background to that, but let me just explain the root. Contemplatio is the Latin translation of theoria, and theoria in Greek is associated with vision, phireo. So that means that theoria is the root, philosophically speaking, of the practice that led to the development of the Latin tradition of contemplatio. Now, when it gets to the 17th century, what happens is that contemplatio and meditatio has been distinguished by the medieval mystics, for people like the Victorians, etc., in the medieval monastic schools. And what they say can vary widely, but one version of it, which is particularly important for that 17th century debate, is that contemplation is to be distinguished from meditation, that one is effortful and the other is not effortful. So that means one, you have to work at it, meditation. You have to train and work at it really hard. You have to be daily sitting, daily praying, daily meditating, etc., in order to get to that clarity of vision. Contemplation, in one way of distinguishing from meditation, is this kind of Teresa talks about the rain, right, and the kind of instinctive outpouring of grace or outpouring of a vision that is completely out of control, right? You don't do it, you don't initiate it, you are passive in receiving that vision. And the debate there is about whether contemplation does involve effort or not, right? Does it require some training? Does it need scripture? Does it need prayer? Or is it anybody who's, the divine choose to reveal will passively receive these because it's purely passive anyway? There's nothing to do with your activity. It's purely by grace that we can contemplate. So that's the kind of debate that happens in the 17th century. And to bring it back closer to science, right? The scientific tradition, the natural philosophers, did think much more in the lines of contemplation results primarily through a series of practice, right? So therefore, that tradition, situated within the Vita Contemplativa, sees natural philosophy as a kind of practice that brings a clarity of vision. You see the inside of the atom. You see the inside of the forms of things because you work at natural philosophy. So there is a sense in which the traditional natural philosophy always take a position there. Though, again, there are some crazy ones, people who don't think that's the case, but I'm talking about more mainstream scientists who did think they were contemplatives.
Something I wanted to ask real quick is a criticism of this entire like project that I often that I'm kind of sympathetic to is that there's no combining science and like complexity science contemplative studies because contemplative is ultimately non-conceptual and non-dual. And so if you're trying to, scientifize and put concepts onto, how's contemplation done and formalize it, you are, by the very act of trying to do that, you're already throwing out the baby with the bathwater, right? And so it's a question of like, so is there anything we can do that's actually fruitful in scientific discourse and development that doesn't kill the spirit of contemplation, right? Somehow. And I feel like you're getting at that, but I wonder if you have more specific.
I just read the comments by Xavier. Do you want to say something on that?
Sure, I can speak to that. Yeah, no, I was just it's sort of related to this question. I'm thinking about the role of like these thought experiments. Einstein very famously used them, but they're kind of throughout the history of at least modern physics. Imagine that you're on a train moving in this way and that you have a laser moving like this, and they never actually build the experiment, but somehow through imagining this scenario, they gain these insights in that case, relativity. And there's a sense in which, again, it feels analogous to the math point I was making earlier, but these kinds of, again, clarity, kinds of like insights about the structure of the universe that come through just kind of like sitting meditatively on the image of this experiment you could imagine running.
I think your example is really good, and I would just say that that's not the only way, but that's a way that is quite obvious. So I recently have read some of Alexandre Gothentik's. I don't know if you know him. He's the guy at the Bourbaki group, right? He went crazy and he wrote 80,000 pages, and now is in the French library. And if you read them, they're basically notes of contemplation. Okay, they're basically notes on how he contemplated, and then he thinks retrospectively the ideas that connected geometry and algebra. So that's a good example of how in mathematics it seems to happen, is that people tend to kind of engage in these sort of thought engagement that maybe Michael would say gives them some ability to control, move around the Platonic space. But Pavel, your point brings me back to kind of my fundamental question that maybe I invite you to keep thinking beyond the session, which is, if contemplation is a first-person engaged activity, can anything that is a first-person engaged activity that is in a sense non-dual and beyond conceptual, how does that utilize or can be functioning within what you know as scientific research? So what I just given you about Gothentik is one example. One example is that he thinks this experience is fundamental to mathematical creativity.
Thanks, Pavel.
There we go.
We are recorded. Okay, so let me try to share this here. I was over ambitious, I think, with the slides that I want to get to. So let's see. I'll skip over some stuff. So I'll just get right into it. So McLeish's thesis in this great book, The Poetry and Music of Science, is that science is like as creative as any other artistic discipline, music, visual arts. And he really focuses his book on creative competencies, visual, narrative, etc., and show how they're at work in science, they're at work in writing a novel, they're at work in kind of all different aspects of human endeavor. And the scientific method, it resembles musical and poetry composition because of its sequence of trial and constraint, revision, some insights. So he's really focusing on the process of doing the work. And he's in touch, and he's worked with kind of medievalists, and especially the work of Robert Grosseteste. And he draws on that intellectual tradition. He's sort of really in touch with the Anglican tradition, especially. And the tools of his craft are, and of a scientist's craft, are analogies and thought experiments, sketching, mathematical symbolism, playing with those symbols, kind of waiting for those tenuous connections to be seen. He focuses also on emotion, and that a successful understanding produces a desire, a draw, that we notice things that are there, we're drawn into it. And in terms of ethics, he talks about how empathy and care and love motivate and give us contentment for our scientific work. And he goes through some case studies of safety and kind of aircraft, things that really serve people's lives, but that it matters looking at the complex polymer physics of combustibility. And then I think a lot of these dynamics are at work in the poetry and music of modeling, whether we're building and symbolic models, computational models, there's always a selection of idealizations and an art of coarse graining to capture the phenomena. Initial models often emerge from analogies and physical intuition and sketches. And there's leaps and they're not just formal derivations. They might be communicated formally after the fact, but not in the via indeniationes, in the way of discovery. There's an area I've been following of simulation-based inference, which is out of sort of bridging the statistical inference community and the physical sciences. And this is where this is sort of approach puts together mechanistic insight with empirical observations in an Bayesian framework that can be very tied to those disciplines. You can have the standard model of particle physics as your forward model, and do inference and have uncertainty estimates on all of those parameters. Yes. And then in terms of the last point with collaboration, there's a sense of, in poetry and music of like an orchestra playing together. And so a lot of these different areas bring and draw on expertise and need a common framework conductor to be synchronized and to understand each other and know their own limits and kind of get guidance for how they could sharpen in ways that serve a bigger whole. Some things I've been following are Julia Pearl's work on causality. Tends to be still sort of in those circles schematic. It's not as easy to operationalize, and with very complex networks. There's been other attempts, like Benyu, her book, to kind of from a different paradigm of rather than sort of like causal diagrams with more Rubin-based approach to causal inference, challenging data science communities to have stronger, more robust conclusions. And so what, you can ask questions like, well, what is the pre-processing of this pipeline and what is the model, and where do those, is there a fine line between those two, or are they blur into each other? So there's also a way that we not only like carve nature at its joints, we carve our process of doing science at its joints in a sense. This is a snippet from a kind of formal probabilistic programming language, Stan, that is like a hammer for some of those approaches. that has a commitment to one type of carving. This is the vignette I wanted to share, this electron microscope simulator that I have contributed to. And we're looking at imaging specimens like proteins and nucleic acid, and we put them in an ontology of what the microscope's doing, what the specimen's doing, their dependency relationships, and then simulating these observes with all their hidden states, and then doing statistical inference in those spaces, having kind of full control on the numerics of this. Maybe I'll just skip that. These are some little code snippets where we were choosing at what level we kind of make these representations and what we bottle in with them, and how we draw on traditions like electron optics and biomolecular simulation, and prepackage other approaches and compose them together. So on panel C, you see like an experimental image. It's got like a little blob on the top left that we haven't simulated, but that's actually there in experiments. And this helps sharpen and how should we account for this thing? Where should we put it in our model? It's a chunk of floating stuff. So we need to have some part of the simulator that breaks up our object into random chunks and places them in. I've done some work also on validation. So in panel C, you have many other inference methods in this space of dealing with images. And then in B, we have these archetypes of types of motion and types of changes, whether it's totally flexible, an antibody domain moving around, or a spike protein continuously wiggling and jiggling, or compositional heterogeneity of different objects. And in D, we had to go through the process of how do we say we're close in shape? If you have someone performing a dance, and then you ask someone to copy that dance, how do you operationalize what it means to be close or far? And that's hard enough when we have some intuition from being embodied and experiencing every day, human motion. But what about the shape motions of these molecules? I also participated in a community challenge where we asked other people, we gave other people data sets, real experimental data sets, simulated data sets in panel B, and then we asked them to submit estimates of what was there, and then had to validate them. And these came out of different methods where they're sort of apples and oranges, because they're not always on the same scale, and they might be having been communicated visually in papers in a similar way. It was hard to quantify that, and we had to pioneer some approaches. So these are some of the questions we kind of went through. Anyway, so here's some discussion questions. So those are kind of my didactic slides. And now I wanted to kind of walk us through a bit of an examination of conscience almost for our ideal workday and for automation. So maybe just take we'll go through these 3 points. There's 3 sets of 3. And I'll just read them out and jot down or mentally note a few things, and then we can share our insights. So I'll walk you through it. This will take about a minute or 2, because we have 10 more minutes, 15 more minutes left. So we're doing pretty good for time. So my ideal workday. So what is my ideal workday like? Well, consider your physical location. Where are you in your day? Do you start from home? Do you take a walk over here? Do you go to the coffee shop there? Who are you interacting with? And what are you talking with them about? How do you balance solitude and sociality? Cycles of celebration in the wider context that gives meaning to your work. So in those vignettes, we had time where I was alone coding. I was uploading pull requests. We were setting up shared online spaces. We had community check-in calls. We had took 2 years to do the whole project, and we gave presents to each other at the end for the core analysis team. And so there was real kind of closure in a sense that we're contributing to these 10, 20, 50 people whose papers I read. And for me, that gave a lot of meaning. There was also a lot of maybe over engineering that was done too much in solitude without checking in. Is this really serving our goals? Do I need more time alone or more time with specific collaborators? What draws me into solitude or into community? And are those desires, are those drives, are they really in harmony with my long-term goals? So I might really enjoy talking with someone about some results, and are they actually giving good feedback? Or are they just someone fun to talk about and have a beer with? And am I avoiding people that could give good feedback because their temperament jars a bit with mine, but they could really help? Do I just need to spend more time, with my fingers on those keys, typing away and have rituals, and I kind of set up a writer's cabin, a time in the silent library and the stacks? Do the needs of others fuel the fire of my motivation? And who are those others? Are they colleagues? Are they the faces I see every day? Is it a small scientific micro community whose papers I read, I'm in touch with? Is it the poor? Is it the disadvantaged? Is it people who are vulnerable? Is it all of humanity? Is it everything? Where this whole thing is going? I put this in my grant motivations. I put these in the first slides of my talks. Okay, so we can kind of circle together here, and I don't know if someone wants to share some ideas.
So we will be closing at, I think, the 40 after, so in about 6-7 minutes. So.
Okay, great.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it's a collection of good questions. I mostly, maybe subconsciously, am sort of asking all the time, either to myself or the people that I'm working with. And I think maybe one of the most relevant is like, in communicating with someone or in collaborating with someone or desiring that they provide some input in the project, it's like, do they share a common vision, right? Either, did I provide a vision that then they find inspiring and then I can bring them along, or do we have two, visions that are the same, or is, is vision completely lacking? And I think that sort of, you know, um, meta question of what we're, asking what we're doing and why is often never explicitly acknowledged, like, and never, aligned, or made explicitly, aligned.
Yeah, I try to just find out what motivates people and where they're going with their career and incentives, and then sort of like, oh, there's this opportunity for you to use those skills or to kind of apply that, and they get excited, and then we learn together. So I think understanding the drives and skills and goals of your team can really help with that.
Mhm.
I almost
Like
feel like,
go ahead, Papa.
okay.
No, I was just asking, like, yeah, just like, what is it that you want to learn, and like, what kind of, where do you want to develop? I think it's like it's very actually rare that we have conversations like that.
Mhm.
Mm.
I was thinking this would be actually great. The Eric and I were just in this mindful research retreat for a couple of weeks in France, which is like, how do you transform the process of research into some kind of practice meditation. But ultimately, I think what's more important is, yeah, into this like ideal workday. How do you like intentionally think of like what is my ideal workday and then try to do that together in a community and really support each other in doing that. So we're probably going to do another one next year. So maybe that would be great if could like collaborate on creating around this because it sounds
Yeah,
like
yeah.
you've thought a
I
lot
put a
about
lot of
these.
thought into this. I've really enjoyed my time at
Hmm.
the Flatiron Institute in New York.
Hmm.
Everyone was there in one building. Everyone shared a lunchroom. There was lots of one-on-ones with visiting speakers. Sometimes we had two-on-ones where there'd be someone and we'd talk to them together. And that helped build that shared vision. We're like, oh, this expert's saying this. This is what works. We have the feedback, which challenge them. And we sort of, oh, this is the direction we should take.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds really powerful, like what you're describing that space. And I feel like these spaces are quite rare in academia,
Yes.
but they exist. Like I've also had like in my whole career, like a year here, like a month here that really inspired me and then gave me motivation for the next like 5 years of a very solitary and miserable PhD.
Right. I mean, those are the places that people write about in books. Like one place that keeps on reoccurring is like Bell Labs. Like there was so much innovation that just like came out of there. And I mean,
So,
I
right,
know
like
there's
coming up with systems for how to, transform more places into those sorts of things.
Yeah.
It's both very fruitful for innovation, but also it's quite a challenge in terms of, right, because it's like people are not predictable. So you can't like engineer them as you engineer cars.
Yeah.
But at the same time, and especially groups, right? Like this community creation. Um, but it can be so powerful in science because there's something really deeply contemplative and spiritual about it if you do it right. So,
Let me quickly flash the other sets of questions. This set was on our language and on inviting us to like be aware of how we can grow our awareness of how to draw analogies, maybe with doing more activities, traveling, wider reading, and there's in my field there's a lot of analogies from military conflict that I think aren't totally apt, even just and describing molecules as simple machines like ratchets and levers. And there's also like motions in a forest and how trees move and how things are intertwined together that could really help, I think. And then the other set was on automation and on, maybe using large language models in our workflows. And even if they don't go into the communicated artifact, how am I being de-skilled with in using those? And how do I want to choose and sort of go for some higher um, kind of goal and accept that I accept using spell check that I'm not as good a speller, but it's just not that important to me. And I think there's analogies of kind of with ages, not just going with the flow, but really deciding how I want to use these tools, what I'm willing to give up, what I'm not, and then choosing when to use, when not to use, what to experiment with, what to try. I find a lot of people have very strong opinions, but they really haven't played around with these tools much at all. Really, our imagination is the limit of asking them to take on personas, critique our work. So yes, these were my other aspects. I think that's pretty much at time, right? 8:40.
yeah. Well, until we get kicked out, we can keep. Yeah, there you go. Okay. Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, I'd love to almost like hear, yeah, this connection to the aesthetics, to the spiritual, right? This like beauty and dance and aesthetic guidance of scientific questions that you mentioned and how I guess you were able to apply this in it's like very formal electron microscope analysis code.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a venue to communicate this, to write it up to. It's been hard to find
Hmm.
like a venue where that fits.
Hmm. Yeah, we have on the website that we just made, we have a list of publication outlets that are, some are academic journals, others are very much not. So among them, maybe, um, or if you find something, you can also send the link. But
Okay.
yeah, thanks.
You're welcome.